Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. And today we are here to talk about what do BizTalk applications look like when migrated to Azure. And I've put a slight caveat in that today's part one really of this, because it's just such a massive topic, we can't do the whole thing. And we're really going to focus on the technology stack and what are the differences in technology between BizTalk and Azure at a component level, and then what we're going to need to we're going to have a follow-up where we talk in more detail about building an application and running through some examples of that. So just to look at today's webinar, what we're going to cover. So we're talking about why now? Why are we talking about this now? And a lot of that's off the BizTalk Migrator, the BizTalk migration tool that Microsoft are about to release. And we're going to talk a bit about differences in paradigm between BizTalk and Azure. So what are the differences in mindset from a design perspective that you use from one technology to another? We're then going to look at the core infrastructure. So what are the building blocks of an application, and in particular, which bits of the technology stack that BizTalk gives you are, how do you carry those across into building an application does a similar thing in Azure Integration Services. We're then going to talk a little bit about some of the essential patterns that support integration, because obviously, as you all know, integration is massively built on patterns. We're then going to look through some of the thorny issues that you have to, some of the things that are a lot more difficult to solve. And then we will round this off by having some Q&A. But please, please do the Q&A in the Q&A box, and we'll get round to those as we go. So moving on. Sorry, I just had a message that someone had a problem with their audio. Okay, so presenters today. I'm Andrew Rivers. I'm a director of 345 Technology, and I've been involved in BizTalk, well, since 2004. And these days I tend to, work much more on cloud data platforms and integration. So integration as a way of feeding data into big data platforms. But I also have with me Dan Probert, who's the CTO of Afinis, and Dan is the world leader in how to design logic apps on AIS. So would you like to say hello, Dan?
Hi guys, thank you, Andrew. Yes, it's good to be back again. I'm looking forward to this presentation.
Excellent. So this is also brought to you by Azure Integration Group. So Azure Integration Group is an initiative to share information and best practice on Microsoft integration, and BizTalk to Azure Integration Services migration in particular. So, and in particular, Azure Integration Group works with tech teams within BizTalk customers, and also we work with customers who are supporting BizTalk customers, consultancy supporting BizTalk customers, and just help them with best practice, particularly in this migration space. So moving on, why now? BizTalk Migrator. So, I think most of the people on this will probably have attended our last webinar, which was about the BizTalk Migrator tool. So Microsoft have announced, they announced in June, so last month, that they're releasing a BizTalk migration tool called the BizTalk Migrator, and that's coming out in autumn 2020. So that actually isn't very far away, depending on where autumn lands. It's September to November timeframe. We're talking 2 to 4 months. So this is so the tooling to migrate people from BizTalk into Azure is actually right around the corner. It's going to be released quite soon. So that makes this kind of and that's made this a hot topic now. That people are asking us about it. People want to know what is what's happening in this space. The other thing is that this announcement has given clues about how BizTalk apps might look in Azure. Certainly, how Microsoft see that the BizTalk apps looking in Azure. And reading between the lines, I mean, Microsoft's presentation on BizTalk 2020 and beyond was mainly focused on the BizTalk Migrator tool. So what that clearly shows is that Azure Integration Services is clearly the future direction for integration on Microsoft technology, and the tooling that they do could help build much of that, much of that core application that at the moment we have to build ourselves. And it's really, we don't know what the tool is going to produce, but given the fact that myself and Dan, we both help clients build service buses in the cloud, we've got a good idea of what we think a good practice would be, and so we're going to share that with you as to how we feel you'll build a service bus. And also let us do the research. If you actually want us to keep in touch with you and let you know whenever Microsoft put out any more information on the BizTalk Migrator or any more useful information, do get in touch. Either put it as a private message in the Q&A and just say yes, keep me informed, or send us an email, contact us on LinkedIn, and we'll keep in touch and we'll let you know when something else comes up that's newsworthy. So starting off, maybe I've talked enough and I'll hand over to Dan, and Dan, you can tell us what is Azure Integration Services?
Sure, thanks, Andrew.
There's a really easy short answer.
This won't take long. If this was a multi-choice exam, I think most people would do well. But I'm guessing most people listening to this or watching this will know. But Azure Integration Services, as Microsoft define it, are a collection of four official, but 5 separate resources. So API management, logic apps, and that includes integration accounts, Azure Service Bus, and Event Grid. That's what Microsoft regards Azure Integration Services are. They're the building blocks, and it lets them come together in a project team, if you like, and handle all those things together, so they all fall under one umbrella. Additionally, though, if you are doing integration in Azure, you're going to need some additional things. So everyone's going to be using Azure Functions, whether that's normal functions, durable functions, that sort of thing. There's a new player in town, which is Azure App Configuration. Lets us store all our configuration information in Azure, and then Key Vault as well, similar to App Configuration, but for storing secrets and passwords and certificates and things like that. There's a lot of overlap here. You'll probably be aware, if you've done any work in Azure, that an integration account can store a certificate, as can Key Vault. But it's a matter of knowing when you use these. So the certificates that are stored in integration accounts are designed to work with the logic app actions relating to EDI, for example, or AS2, or any of the sort of trading partner management. Whereas Key Vault is a place for storing sensitive information, so it protects it. It's a bit like using password.
Key Vault's a generic thing that's used right throughout the Azure platform.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah. So there's a link down there at the bottom to Microsoft's webpage on AIS, Azure Integration Services, and on there is a white paper that talks about what the product is as a whole, what the group of resources in Azure do as a whole. But it helps because now we can talk about, instead of having to talk about logic apps and service bus and API management as separate entities, we now just say AIS, and people know what we mean. We're talking about all the different resources in Azure that allow us to do development, develop integration scenarios in Azure. So I just wanted to make sure everyone's on the same page there. So.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take a slightly different view of that, and almost approach the same thing from a different angle, and sort of say, a lot of people, when they look at integration on the Azure platform, they're saying, well, isn't Azure integration just logic apps? It seems like a lot of people have that perception that there's this thing called logic apps is the beginning and the end of integration on the Azure platform, and that as such it's quite good for trivial things and it's not really enterprise grade. So what are the other things we're kind of thinking about when we talk about the core infrastructure? So I mean, the first thing is the core of any kind of integration thing is ultimately messaging, isn't it? And being able to put things on and off a message bus. We then need obviously it's the event processing. So when being able to trigger something to happen because an event has happened, either a message has arrived, a file has arrived, a document has arrived. We then encapsulate our bits of logic in functions and APIs. So that's how we separate out workflow from workflow from functions, so that the functions are easily versionable, testable, deployable, and the workflow is just a way of routing between them. And obviously every application somewhere or other needs storage. So underpinning all this, there will be storage accounts. And an API management is also a really big part. I mean, this is something that actually in the BizTalk world that wasn't really handled particularly, because BizTalk was very much an on-prem system. So, but as you go into more of a cloud-based system or cloud-based paradigm with APIs, then how you manage APIs, how you secure them, how you cache REST calls, and how you translate between legacy sort of web service APIs and REST ones, that becomes a really key part of your infrastructure. And again, there's the configuration side of it. So how we store app configuration, but also how we store secrets, and those are so from that from that list of ingredients that Logic Apps maybe provide us with the workflow backbone. But what we're looking at is building all those other things into an app, and composing an equivalent to an enterprise grade app based on all those other factors. So Dan, when we get to, I suppose when we get to, given we've just talked about all those things, what how do you then approach really the differences in how you think about an application? So what would be so if we start off with server versus serverless.
Yeah.
Where would you start on that?
So that's an interesting one, because the move to cloud is removing all the infrastructure aspects, or most of the infrastructure aspects for you, especially if you're using PaaS or SaaS solutions. So with BizTalk, we're thinking about number of servers. We're thinking about performance in our SQL Server. If we want high throughput, we're like, how do we spin up additional BizTalk instances? How do we handle clustering of SQL Server, things like that? The cloud takes almost all of that away. Now it's serverless. So there are, which is a bit of a misnomer, because there are servers, everything's running on a server, but we don't worry about it. Microsoft look after all that for us. There's dynamic scaling, so everything gets scaled up as we need it.
Yeah, I mean, we still kind of worry about it when we get the bill at the end of the month, though, right?
Yes, indeed, we do. But it means that we're no longer thinking about deployment in the same way. With BizTalk, especially anyone that's worked on a large BizTalk installation, you're thinking about, well, how many licenses can I afford? And how many servers am I going to need to handle my workload? And if certain times of the year I've got a peak, so maybe you're a retail site and that around the holiday season, Independence Day or
Black Friday.
Black Friday, for example, you're going to get a lot of sales. So you might be laying on extra servers just for that one day and paying licenses, and you'll be thinking about
or
that.
you might be jumping through hoops to try to manage the workload.
Yes.
through those peaks. So you might be talking.
Yes. And banks have the same problem. I know banks, for example, often people have their direct debits or automatic payments coming out at the end of the month or the beginning of a month. So there's a huge influx of payments on a certain day, or transactions on a certain day. So serverless removes some of those issues, especially when we have sort of elastic scaling. So we don't have to worry about the servers we're being deployed onto. That's managed for us. So that's one big difference.
Okay, and I mean, obviously, in BizTalk we have adapters, and in AIS we have connectors. What are the key differences in how they're used and how we work with those?
Well, conceptually they're very, very similar. The main difference is in terms of what they do internally. So an adapter is designed to facilitate the connection to an external system generally. So, you know, I might be using the SQL adapter. So it knows how to talk to SQL. It handles the generation of the schemas that I might need. It handles any errors and resuming things. Where connectors are very similar. Sometimes, and people might be unaware of this, but connectors sometimes have workflow inside them. So they're doing little bits of work for you. So from a paradigm point of view, they're almost, they can be thought of as syntactically similar. You know, if I talk about the Salesforce connector, for example, it handles, and I connect to a table, it handles giving me the JSON schema I need to make changes into Salesforce. If I use the SQL adapter in BizTalk, it's going to give me, once I say what table I want, it's going to give me a schema, an XML schema for making some sort of datagram update, if that's how I'm using it, or a stored procedure call. So they're very, very similar. The difference is around the properties that you get with them. So adapters tend to be richer in terms of the configuration than connectors are, but then we have a lot more connectors and logic apps than we do adapters in BizTalk.
Yeah, and I think I mean, this, you know, conceptually as well. I mean, adapters do a lot of the heavy lifting of actually running all the working ports, don't they? Whereas
yes,
whereas connectors are very much more just handling the edge part of the connection.
Yes, I think that's quite right.
Okay, message box versus message bus, because obviously, you know, everything in BizTalk goes through the message box.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is quite an interesting one as well, because I mean, we'll see this a little bit later, but that BizTalk gives you so much out of the box. There's so much that's provided that's almost invisible. We sort of, it's like when you're driving a car, you know, you don't think about what's going on under the hood or anything like that. You're vaguely aware, but it's all provided for you. You're just using it. And ditto with BizTalk. BizTalk provides us a lot of functionality that we just take for granted, and we only notice when it goes wrong. But we'd very quickly notice if it wasn't there. Now the message box is an interesting one. It's, you know, the message box is what we use for PubSub. So we publish a message to the message box, and then we have hopefully one or more subscribers, and it's implemented via SQL Server. So we're then limited with what we can and can't do because of the limitations on SQL Server. So if you're after, I mean, people that have tried low latency in BizTalk will know this, that low latency in BizTalk is all about tuning SQL Server, because
it's about shorter and shorter polling intervals, isn't it?
Well, I was about to say, because the way SQL Server works, or the way BizTalk works in SQL Server, is it's running a job on a polling cycle. Are there new messages? Are there new messages? Not event driven. Message bus is slightly different, because a message bus provides a lot more out of the box. The message box providing just PubSub, the message bus can do that as well. We get ordered delivery, things like that. You know, service bus is giving us the concept of a message bus as well. But if you look at it as a pattern point of view, then we get a lot more with a message bus pattern than we do with just a message box on its own. I think this will become clearer when we look at what a message bus actually is. But if we think about, say, message bus just in technology terms, we think about, say, service bus. Service bus gives us a richer technology stack than we get with just the message box on its own. And service bus gives us a lot of the functionality we get from BizTalk outside of the message box. For example, order delivery, for example, which generally is handled by, you know, I think it's handled by the endpoint manager in BizTalk, and it uses the message box to achieve that. But the message bus is more like a service given to us with a whole lot of features that we can take advantage of. And in fact, we actually get more in the message bus than we get in BizTalk as a whole. It's whether or not we want to use it, because some of the features that we get in the message bus we don't have in BizTalk, so we've never been able to take advantage of them.
But it's also you know, there's a really big conceptual difference in how message buses are built from cloud. I mean, if you know, obviously message box is ultimately it revolves around database tables, and you've got SQL locks on things as things, you know, as messages have moved in and out of the message box. Whereas cloud messaging technology tends to be more like a producer and consumer model where the producers are effectively writing to the end of a list, and consumers are reading everything in that list and then seeing what's relevant to them, so that you don't actually have any blocking of that process, which is kind of why sort of the cloud message buses are so massively more scalable than the message box. That's another really key thing, because as you know, anyone that's done high throughput BizTalk stuff knows, if you get, I don't know, 20,000, 30,000 messages on your spool, it's bad things happen.
Yes.
Whereas on a message bus, it's almost that doesn't matter, but you're more constrained on how much load you've got on your consumer side, rather than how many things are actually on your bus at any one time.
That's very true.
So moving on, XML versus JSON. Obviously,
which one do you prefer?
we all know and love XML, and I prefer YAML. There was XML sort of captured the whole of sort of software development at one point, particularly around the time .NET came out, and serialization of web service and that sort of thing was, and that was around the same time that BizTalk was coming out, and so BizTalk was kind of so baked into that XML paradigm, in the fact that all the message types in BizTalk are XML message types.
Yep.
Or it's binary.
Yes.
And whereas the world has moved on, and for the last 10 years, REST APIs and JSON have been the sort of the key thing. So is there any difference, though, apart from the fact that they're different serialization formats? Is there anything really different in the way that we use those message formats, or is it just kind of
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, the thing to bear in mind is XML that were designed for different reasons. I mean, so XML is a chatty language, or chatty format, I guess, message format. It's easy to read as a human. You can look at it and you can see the node names. Oh, okay. JSON is harder to read. I mean, once you get your head around it, it's not too bad, but it's not as easy to read, but it's less chatty, so it takes up less space. So one of the things that I'm sure people have worked with in BizTalk is that sometimes, especially with, say, the SAP adapter, you end up with these massive XML messages. So in theory, a JSON message is going to be slightly smaller because it doesn't have the sort of N tags that you get with JSON. Another big advantage of JSON is objects.
Yeah, it's only got the element name once, not twice.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah, and especially if the element names are big. Plus, if you've got an array, you're not repeating the element names each time in an array. And JSON has support for objects, which XML does not. One of the interesting things, though, you have to be a little bit careful of, and I know people that have fallen foul of this in BizTalk, is that moving from XML to JSON and JSON back to XML isn't guaranteed to keep type fidelity. And what that means is that you can't guarantee that when you convert from XML to JSON and then you convert from that message back to XML, that the two original XML messages are going to be the same. There's no guarantee of that. It depends on the message. So you have to be a little bit aware of that the two aren't quite interchangeable. And one of the issues we have with BizTalk today in JSON is although that they put it on the product box, now supports JSON, for BizTalk. It supports JSON by converting JSON to XML, because BizTalk is XML centric. It's what it knows. It's what we work with. Everything in there is XML. But AIS and Logic Apps in particular is all JSON. So everything is JSON.
And it's natively JSON.
Well, it's It is,
yeah.
But the thing to bear in mind that actually I can just imagine being corrected by the product group at this point, that Logic Apps in particular are content type based. So the engine looks at what the content type is of the received message. It's just that the designer treats JSON as a first-class citizen. So if it's JSON, you've got support for JSON schemas, you've got support for JPath, which is the query language we use inside Logic Apps. If you move to XML, We can use it. We've got support with XML with the XPath expression, but it's not a first-class experience. You don't get the little tokens that you can work with like you do with JSON. But it will work. It will work with XML. You can move XML all the way through. So, but there is a change there that if you're working with something that's predominantly XML and in BizTalk, and you want to work in Logic Apps, you will get better support if you convert that to JSON. But then you run into that problem that if you then have to go back out as XML, you've got to do a lot of testing to make sure you're not losing any fidelity if you miss it.
Okay, so one of the other things we've got on mindset is messages versus events. Yeah, because obviously everything on BizTalk happens because a message arrives, really. Whereas in the in cloud world, we rely quite heavily for a lot of things on events. So you might get, so a file might be uploaded into blob storage, and you may want to, but you may process an event that says a file has arrived, but that event isn't the file.
Yes.
Whereas in in BizTalk land, it's the file is the event.
Yes. Although having said that, before Event Grid arrived in Azure, it was much harder to do this. But you're quite right. If there's a file that has arrived, I don't want to be polling to see if that's arrived. I don't want a message arriving. I want an event to be raised. I want it's event handling. I want to be notified that something's happened, and I can go and check and see if I'm interested in it. As the way it should work. And that's kind of key also to low latency as well in terms of event handling. When something happens, I want to know immediately. I don't want to be on a polling cycle where there's an operational overhead or a transactional overhead for polling. I just want to know. I want to be notified, and that's great. It's brilliant that we can do that.
And polling is ultimately, isn't it? Because polling means that you're standing up infrastructure that is just. And that's what its job is. Whereas events mean that you react. You react with infrastructure when things happen, not in case they happen.
Yes, although it's important, Andrew, to note that, and most people working with Logic Apps might know this, that a lot of the connectors in Logic Apps still use polling. The Service Bus connector is an example that you're polling to see if there's a change, and my assumption is that will move to using Event Grid or event notifications at some point. I know there's some limitations there due to what SKU of Service Bus are using, but some connectors will have to use polling, like FTP, for example. There's no standardized mechanism that you could use to have an event when a file arrives for FTP at the moment, because that's not how FTP works. But it could do for a file, like a file arriving in storage. You could. That's brilliant.
Yeah. Okay, and the last one on this list before we move on to some of the kind of the deeper tech stuff is transactions versus transaction and compensation. Because if you're in a world where everything's in the cloud and it's connected via REST APIs, you don't have atomic transactions. They're just they're gone, aren't they?
They kind of are. Well, they don't make any sense anymore. So BizTalk, one of the big things about BizTalk, and if you've ever tried to install BizTalk in Azure in VMs, so infrastructure as a service, spinning up VMs, running BizTalk, for a long time there was no support for it because BizTalk relies on distributed transactions. And again, this is hidden from you. But if I'm in BizTalk and I in my orchestration, I am doing some work and I'm writing out to BAM, then BizTalk's opening a transaction, a distributed transaction that could be running across multiple servers or at least multiple databases, because it will have a transaction open against the message box and the management database, but also against the BAM databases as well, so your primary interrupt database as well. That will all be a transaction that's open. So once the service completes, then everything is committed. But if something goes wrong, it all gets rolled back, because you don't want to be in a situation where BAM data might be written out, but your service has failed or something like that. So BizTalk handles distributed transactions for you across those. But they don't make any sense in a serverless world. We don't have the same sort of database-driven need in, say, a Logic Apps world or a cloud world. However, we do need to handle failure, and that's where compensation comes in. When we have compensating transactions in BizTalk, I don't know how often people use them, but if you make a call to one system and then you make a call to the second system and the call to the second system fails and you can't do that inside, say, an atomic transaction, then you have to use compensation. You have to say, well, I have to manually go back to that first system and say, actually, you know what, I want to cancel what I just did. And that's how we would do it in the cloud world. You look at your compensation. So what do you do if something further down your workflow fails? How do you roll that back? Because you're not rolling back in a database way, you're compensating. I want to undo what I did or cancel what I did, or at least notify you that the state that you've got or the information that you've got can't be relied upon anymore because something failed further down the workflow.
Yeah. Now that's a really good explanation of that. So let's so one of the things we mentioned before was the whole thing about BizTalk. Actually, it's a massive product and it gives you a ton of stuff out of the box. So do you want to just quickly run through run through some of this list and pick out the highlights?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot here. I mean, this is only this isn't everything that BizTalk gives us, but BizTalk gives you a lot. So in fact, I've got to come closer to be able to read it. So we get a lot of adapters. We get 20 odd adapters depending on which version of BizTalk you're running with. We get pub sub out of the box based on the message box. We get correlation support, which allows us to do things like convoys and things like that. We get ordered delivery. We get a workflow engine, which is orchestrations, and that comes with ports and dynamic ports and correlation and promoted properties. We get Veta pipelines, so validate, encode, transform, and route pipelines out of the box as well. So Veta is a pattern. Transforms based on XSLT. We get XML and binary message supports. We do get JSON support of a sort. There's a huge amount we get. Automated failed message handling, failed message routing. Customization, we can create custom pipeline components, custom adapters. We get the admin console that allows us to see, running and suspended instances and resume things and the like. And then, of course, we get BAM and the rules engine, suspended instance handling, EDI, trading partner management, batched message support. ACNAC is quite important. You never generally see that, but under the covers, that's how the adapters work. So the adapters know whether something has failed. There's a lot there out of the box that we get. Yeah,
and it's almost like we take that for granted in many ways.
We do, yes.
Because that's just because effectively BizTalk is like platform as a service for it's an integration platform as a service that you install on-prem. So when you write an application for it, you're assuming that all this stuff is just already there for you, and hence you don't necessarily think about it all that much. So if we go through if we now have a look at the equivalent list in AIS and we say, well, what does AIS give us? Then we've got quite a lot of the same stuff, but it's so let's go through this, but sort of do a compare and contrast on that to sort of see where what the commonality is, but also what the subtle differences are in some of these things.
So I guess the thing that first in terms of numbers, AIS gives us, I mean, I've counted 351 connectors. It keeps going up seemingly every week. So there's over 350 connectors connecting to different systems, although they're mainly cloud-based systems. Whereas for BizTalk,
so effectively it's making
on-premise.
So effectively they're because a lot of the BizTalk ones are technical connectors like HTTP, like FTP, like and TCP, whereas the Logic Apps ones, they're really sort of make it easy to connect to specific things. You want to connect to Twitter. I mean, I don't know anyone that's written a real app connecting to Twitter, but I know you can do it. And like you say, Salesforce, but a lot of the SaaS products, Office 365. It's more the fact that they're actually under the bonnet. They're all REST calls, but it's just wrapping those up in a way that's easy to consume.
Well, it makes it much easier. If you're in BizTalk and you wanted to connect to Salesforce, for example, you have to handle OAuth yourself because Salesforce needs that. And then effectively it's a REST call. You have to write all the code yourself and handle the exceptions. Salesforce Connector handles all that for you. It does all the authentication for you. Use API connections for storing your authentication information. And it handles the translation and the error handling and everything for you. And ditto with all the other systems that are supported. It makes it very easy. And then something to talk about a little bit, I'm jumping ahead now, is with hybrid connectivity. Even if you're using BizTalk on premises today, and you want to connect to something like, I keep going back to Salesforce, but it could be Twilio, it could be Office 365, it could be Exchange Online, something like that. There is a case to say that you could use AIS for that, because there's obviously a Logic Apps adapter for BizTalk, which will connect to a Logic App and execute a Logic App, just like there's a BizTalk connector for Logic Apps as well. So you can connect, you can actually work with interop and connect both the systems together. But going through this, there's a lot of commonality here, because we get PubSub with AIS through Service Bus. We get correlation as well using Service Bus sessions. We get order delivery, which is another Service Bus feature. We get a workflow engine powered by Logic Apps. We get Veta pipelines, we get transforms, we get XML and binary message support, although that's a bit more limited, especially the XML support. We get JSON support, although it's first class. We get a level of customization. You know, you can write custom connectors if you want. If you want to write code, then you're either doing inline JavaScript in a Logic app, or you're writing code in functions or APIM. Then we get things like auto scale up. We don't get that in BizTalk at all. You know, that would be brilliant if BizTalk automatically, you know, installed and started up new instances and then shut them down afterwards. We get inbuilt support for parallelism. So, you know, a for loop in a Logic app is inherently parallel. There's nothing you have to do to get that. You know, if I'm iterating over an array with, you know, 30 items, Logic Apps will by default spin up 30 parallel instances of the code running inside that for each loop. Batch message handling we get as well, like we do in BizTalk. But you know, we don't get any server management, so there's no concept of the BizTalk admin console. But then there's no SQL Server dependency as well, you know, which is quite a big thing as well in terms of tuning, which means that if you want to tune for low latency, Microsoft do that for you. You know, we don't have to actually do the work. So it's a mixed bag.
And similarly with the, yeah, we don't need to manage servers, but we still get but you can actually still see the operational trace of what's happened. So you still get that.
Yes.
Yeah, you still get the equivalent of hat,
Yes.
or the but better.
Well, it's a richer debugging environment, Andrew. That's the thing. You know, in a Logic app, I mean, you know, if something goes wrong in my Logic app, I can look at the run and see exactly what happened at each stage. You know, you can't easily do that. I mean, there is the orchestration. I've gone blank the name of the tool for looking at, you know, the debugging and orchestration.
Well, the orchestration debugger.
Yes, the orchestration debugger. That would be it. You know, but I don't. You know, that's a tricky one to use. It's not as easy to use. So. Again, swings and roundabouts on this. I think it's a broader ecosystem in Azure, but certain things that are easy in BizTalk are not quite so easy in AIS. But then other things that we've never been able to do in BizTalk, or that were difficult in BizTalk, are now really easy.
Yeah, like I say, like auto scale is a good example of that. So what we're going to talk about now actually is and we touched on this last time, that effectively we can look at patterns, because I think we'll talk a little bit about patterns now, but we'll also talk a lot more detail in future sessions on those, because they are kind of so. Talk forces you to implement PubSub, because everything is everything in BizTalk goes to the message box, and the message box is PubSub, whether you like it or not. You can't even do point to point.
There's no queuing. I can't have a queue.
You can't have a queue. You have to do PubSub. But BizTalk also encourages you to use other patterns. So you know, content-based router, you know, canonical messages, correlation. Those are very easy to do, because obviously you have you publish and you have two different subscriptions, when then you've got a content-based router. It's all so after pub sub, that's a kind of a very easy one. Obviously, by using transformation in your pipelines, you can use canonical message formats so that you can then easily go from different systems. And correlation, tying things together. So, for example, if you're sending via HTTP for an orchestration, you have to use correlation because it's the only way you can route the message back. But again, it's one of those things that you almost get it for free and you almost don't think about it. And BizTalk supports, also allows you to implement many more patterns, such as scatter gather, sequential convoy, parallel convoys, all those sort of ones. Now, when we had the announcement from Microsoft about the BizTalk migrated tool, what they did is one of the things they released was this image here, which shows what we've deduced from this is showing an FTP receive port broken down into AIS. What's interesting in this is the approach to patterns on it, because one of the things you can see going all the way through it is a routing slip router, and that's a kind of an enterprise integration pattern. That's a well-known, well tried and tested pattern. There's a content-based router mentioned in there, so that's another routing pattern. So obviously Microsoft's kind of thinking on this is that it's going to draw very, very heavily on some of these patterns to make things happen. So in terms of AIS logic apps, let's talk a little bit about some of the essential patterns and how we might implement those ones in AIS. So so we talked briefly about pub sub, but for those who don't, for those who haven't really done much service bus work, can you talk a little bit about how this works on service bus topics and what that means when you actually come to implement it?
Yeah, so pub sub is an easy one, really. Service bus topics give us the ability to publish a message and then create a subscription. So a subscription in service bus is a collection of filters or rules, I should say. And for each subscription, we have a rule with filters in there, and the filter language, which is quite similar to sort of OData, we can say we're looking for certain values within there. So pub sub with service bus topics means that we publish to a topic and we have one or more subscriptions. And if you were developing with service bus without using logic apps, you'd be writing a consumer that's consuming messages off the subscription or off the topic. One of the main differences, though, is, and I'm sure a lot of people have hit this before, is that when you publish in BizTalk, you get a failure if there are no subscribers. Yeah, there's an instant failure. It doesn't work quite the same in service bus. It depends how you've set it up. So there's actually more flexibility for pub sub in service bus for your topics than there is in BizTalk.
But it's back to that whole thing of the fact that you've got producers producing work onto the service bus and you've got consumers taking work off it, and because a consumer doesn't know anything about the other consumers, that's why you don't get the failed message routing in the same way, because
that's exactly right. Yeah, they're completely independent. They're isolated from each other.
Completely independent. And I think the other thing that's kind of a bit of a difference is that for example, in BizTalk, you create a subscription when you create a send port, by putting a filter expression in it, or you create you actually create a subscription when you bind a port to an orchestration, or you create a subscription when an orchestration, when you have the receive shape in an orchestration, you put a filter in there. So you've got different ways of creating filters, and they appear as subscriptions in BizTalk. But with service bus, you have to explicitly create those subscriptions. They're almost more of something you create on the service bus rather than what you create on the app. Yes,
that's very true. In fact, if you're using a logic app and you're using the service bus connector to pull messages, one or more messages off a topic, you're using a subscription, but the subscription isn't part of unlike say with Event Grid, where the subscription is created by the logic app. In this case, the subscription is not created by the logic app. It's a separate entity. In fact, a subscription is a resource in Azure as well. I mean, one thing to bear in mind is that Service Bus is, we could talk for an hour about Service Bus alone. It's a very rich messaging system, and so when you even implementing PubSub, you need to think about things like partitioning. Do we need to put that on? Do we want partitioning? Do we want multiple message brokers depending on number of messages we've got and how that impacts on logic apps and things like that? So there's a lot more that we get and we have to think about with Service Bus and PubSub than we would do with BizTalk. BizTalk gives us a very limited view of how we do PubSub. And that flexibility is good in some ways because it gives us more choice for how we do things, but it's also harder because there's more choice. There's more things we have to think about and set up than we would have had to with BizTalk.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but also, I mean, how does then, how would then we describe correlation and how correlation fits in to the Service Bus? Because effectively it's kind of correlation kind of piggybacks on the same thing or a similar thing in BizTalk. It's because correlation is a temporary subscription, but how does that work in Service Bus sessions?
Well, in Service Bus, we have the concept of sessions, which indicate that all messages that share the same session ID will be handled within that same session. So as an example, if you've got a message broker, a message consumer, a consumer of some sort. So take an example, a logic app, and I say that I'm interested in all messages that have the same session ID. I set that up, and therefore all messages that have that same session ID end up coming to that single logic app instance. So it's very similar to a correlation ID inside BizTalk. You don't have to use sessions, you can turn it off, but if you're using sessions, it means that we can support, instead of spinning out lots of different logic apps, each working independently on messages, we can say, well, we want all of the ones that are related to come to one place. And in fact, Service Bus sessions is how ordered delivery works as well, because it's meaning that with ordered delivery, we effectively are serializing. We want to process things sequentially. We do the number one, then number two, then number three, and that happens in a similar sort of way. So it's funny actually, because in BizTalk we don't think about correlation. It's provided. We create correlation sets where we say we want to subscribe to messages where these things work together. These two properties, where a message has these two properties, we want it to come back to the same instance. We do the same thing but slightly differently in Service Bus by using that session ID, and the session ID can be whatever we want, but it works in a very similar way.
Yeah. So, okay. So, is there anything else? I'm just conscious that we need to move on to some of the thorny issues and still leave a bit of time for Q&A. But is there anything else on convoys that you particularly want to call out?
Not really. I mean, I guess convoys are slightly trickier to do. I mean, a sequential convoy is not that difficult because you're effectively, if you're doing a sequential convoy in BizTalk, you've got a receive shape and then you go into a loop and you're again receiving additional messages to the same instance of an orchestration until you either time out or you hit some sort of limit. We do something similar using session support in Logic Apps. So a sequential convoy is quite simple to implement and works in a very similar way. But yeah, no, I think the thing is that for these patterns there is an equivalent. It's not necessarily a like for like, but there's an equivalent for how you implement them in an AIS. Okay,
so here's some. So the other thing is some thorny issues that we need to solve. So okay, so let's start with hybrid connections. So obviously, if we're in the cloud and we still have on-prem stuff, then it's almost quite easy going from on-prem and pushing stuff up to the cloud, because the cloud is ultimately is all accessible via HTTP. It's never kind of as straightforward coming back the other way, because quite rightly you have firewalls and things to stop people from coming from the cloud into your business. So are there any particular things on hybrid connectivity you'd kind of want to call out as that people should particularly be thinking about?
Well, there's quite a bit there. I mean, Microsoft's hybrid story is very strong, I think, in that you've got multiple choices. If you've got a strong firewall, then you've got two choices. One is that you create a virtual network up in Azure, and you're using either a VPN or express route to connect those together. You can put your logic apps in integration service environment, which means they're inside a virtual network. And now they're effectively an extension of your on-premises network. So you might regard it as a private cloud, if you like. And they're connected via a backbone, and you wouldn't know the differences as if they're on-prem. But if you don't want to do that, then you've got things like the on-premise data gateway, which spun out of the Power BI project some years ago. And that's a reverse proxy, effectively, where it makes a connection from your on-premises network up to Azure. So it's going outbound. So there's no inbound ports you need to open. And it makes a connection up, and it's using Service Bus to look for work to do. So it's seamless to you, though. So if I'm in a Logic app and I say, hey, I want to go and get the contents of an on-premise SQL server, so I want to execute a stored procedure on premises, your Logic app takes that request, bundles it up, puts it in a special hidden Service Bus queue or topic that you never see, and then on the on-premise data gateway service that's running on-prem connects to that same Service Bus queue, if you like, pulls out that little bundle of work, unpacks it locally, goes, oh, you want to execute a SQL Server stored procedure? I'll execute that locally, gets back the data, squirts the data back up to the topic, or the queue, and then the Logic app picks up that that response and provides it to your Logic app. But it's seamless. You don't see it. You don't have to do anything. It's just there, and it handles large amounts of data, and latency isn't bad. But that's the benefit of it, is that you can do it without having to open up your firewall at all. So there's a lot of things that you've got a lot of choice of how you connect these together. The fact that we have the BizTalk connector for Logic apps, and we have the Logic apps adapter for BizTalk, means that we can sort of integrate in BizTalk and Logic apps together. So I can easily take advantage of Logic app connectors from BizTalk if I'm not ready to migrate, or I want to start the migration by, moving some of my workflow up into the cloud. You can do that today quite easily.
Cool. So exception management. I mean, we talked about the things like the fact that BizTalk gives you a certain amount of ACK and NACK and failed message routing and suspended messages, that sort of thing. Are there any particular things we want to call out that you would solve differently in AIS?
Yeah, a little bit. Exception management is an interesting one. The BizTalk pattern flows strongly from the fact it's written in .NET. So in an orchestration, we basically have a try catch. So we have a catch block. We try some stuff and then we catch it. AIS, it's done very differently. So if you're working in, say, a function, you're using, say, C#, then you'll be using the same sort of thing. But exception management or exception handling is based upon HTTP. So you're looking at HTTP status codes. I call a Logic app and it's going to return me a 200 if it succeeds, or a 202 if it's continuing on working, or something like that, or 500 if there's a problem, or 4xx if there's a problem, a client problem. So exception management is a bit different. One of the first things that I think people struggle with when they're developing Logic apps in particular is, how do you handle faults? And the answer is it's handled via a number of ways, but the most important one probably is the run after, what we call run after. So that we say, well, when an action executes, should the next action execute if the first one succeeds or if it fails? So you end up having branches of code that handle, if something goes wrong, we go here. And they introduced a few years ago the concept of what they call scopes, which effectively is a grouping. It's not really a scope as we would know it in BizTalk, but it lets us group actions in a Logic app and then take action as to whether or not the entire scope failed or succeeded, or one of the items in the scope failed. We can then decide what to do. Personally, I think exception handling in Logic apps, at least, is harder than it is in BizTalk, mainly because it's a different arena. We're designed for massive scale in Logic apps, and if something goes wrong, we end up with a massive amount of fault data, if that's what you're doing. I think it's harder to work it out.
Yeah, and ultimately, a try-catch is an easy thing to get your head around.
It is indeed.
It's a very it's a programming construct we've used for years and years and years and years. And okay, BizTalk gives you a visual representation of it. but not quite the same. Whereas run afters is a bit more fluid.
Yeah.
It's not an if this, it's not effectively an if then else. It's there's a whole load of permutations that you can do on that. So it's very rich and it's very capable of doing things, but it's not it's not as straightforward and as easy to use. Login instrumentation, I mean, that's very, very different again, because BizTalk, a lot of the alerting in BizTalk goes straight onto event logs, which is tied to a local machine. And in the cloud, you just simply don't have the concept of a local machine to go and look at the events on. So all your login instrumentation needs to be externalized.
And very much so. I mean, you get a large amount out of the box with logic apps, but you get more logging with logic apps and functions than you do with BizTalk. But it depends on the type of logging. So what we might treat in BizTalk is, say, debug logging. I want to output something to do with a message. You actually get that with logic apps, and you can also do tracked properties as well. So you can specify these particular values that are coming out of an action or something are going to be put in the log as well. But it's different again. It's done in a very different way. Instrumentation, again, I mean, you can use Azure Monitor. There's a lot of richness there that we don't get with BizTalk. We have to use external tools to get it as well.
So I mean, a particular favorite of mine is App Insights. That's a fantastic piece of kit for being able to trace through applications that is really hard in BizTalk, and actually with App Insights it suddenly makes things really, really easy. And as far as management goes, I mean, okay, we're used to BizTalk admin console, suspending, resuming messages. What's the kind of the parallels that people need to get their head around in AIS?
Well, it's difficult with that one because there's no concept of suspend and resume. You can rerun a logic app using the same data even after you've made changes, but there's not really an equivalent in terms of suspending something and resuming it. We don't have persistence points, for example, in a logic app where we can resume from the same point. I mean, there is under the covers, as far as I'm aware, the engine can automatically resume a logic app if it fails halfway through. But as end users, we don't get the same amount. We have to create all that.
Okay, so I suppose the other thing is, what is it you can't do? And I suppose that the first one we talked about was atomic transactions out of the box. Yeah. Now, what we've put in the list here is also compensating transactions, but you can do compensating transactions. Just they're kind of different, isn't it?
Yeah. There's no built-in support.
It's not built in. You have to build that yourself. So you can do it in AIS, but it's back to this whole thing of the run after, and having to choose the right run after, and then build that compensating action yourself.
Very much so.
And then BAM.
Everyone's favorite.
Oh, we love BAM. Sort of. Does anyone use BAM? So give a high five in the Q&A if you use BAM. let's wait for the tumbleweed. So BAM obviously is again it's just a very different concept, because in the cloud world you kind of tend to avoid this whole thing of writing to a database. What you tend to do is you tend to have events that are pushed out, and then you can feed them into other systems. So for example, like say if you're using BAM to trace processes, then App Insights can be really good for that. If you're using BAM to give you stats, then you've got what's the name of it? I didn't know this is setting to go. It's the Azure Time Series Insights.
Oh, the Time Series Insights.
It's the Time Series Insights, which is an absolutely amazing view on real-time data if you're doing that. So again, you don't get BAM, but you get other things you can use. Even if you want to sort of send your stuff into Splunk and use that, it's almost like it's almost like you've got an embarrassment of riches with what you can do with data when compared to what you could do with BAM.
But you don't get anything that supports, like I don't get the equivalent of a tracking properties. I can't automatically output.
But you don't get
data.
Yeah. So you have to originate that. So if there's data you're originating, then yeah, you have to originate that yourself. But once you've done that, the options can be quite easy. And rules engine. Well, what can we say about rules engine? So the rules engine. How many people use the rules engine strictly for rules? And if you use the rules, as opposed to being able to put like thresholds in for branching logic and that sort of thing. But also, there's many ways of writing rules that are more maintainable and easier to test than the rules engine. So, what are your thoughts on rules engine in rules engine equivalents, Dan?
Well, I guess the thing is, okay, if you're using the rules engine for configuration, look at Azure App Configuration. Move your configuration somewhere else. If you're using the rules engine for what it should be used for, which is you're properly forward chaining logic to work out answers to things, there are some good open source rules engines you could look at. But then you've got the problem of migrating your existing policies and vocab and things like that to a new rules engine. Tell the truth, there's not a good answer here, really. It depends what you're using it for. But it's one of the pain points that we have at the moment. And when we've worked with customers, we have to look at how they're using the rules engine and then work out what the appropriate thing to migrate to is.
Yeah, so it's not, and I think similarly, this is something that Microsoft get asked a lot, and the thoughts on this are developing as well, because I think there's been musings about whether the rules engine will be replaced by something AIS or ported into AIS, or whether it'll be you can install it as a standalone thing irrespective of BizTalk. I don't know what I don't know what that'll be, but I think it's a known kind of it's a known missing piece of the puzzle, I think, is all we can say about that. So moving on again, SSO. Again, talk about sort of something that gets used and abused in all sorts of different ways. So
I'm just very aware that we're at time now. We might have to go a little bit over, but with SSO, again, BizTalk uses it internally for configuration storage. It's designed for storing credentials and linking them. I don't. Do you know what? I haven't worked with many companies that actually use it for what it's designed for affiliate applications and credentials and the like. A lot of people use it as a config store, again, because it has the benefit of being available across all BizTalk instances and automatically updating itself. So it's cached, but the cache is updated. We don't really have an equivalent today. We've got Azure App Config for config. The .NET client libraries, especially the extension one available for functions today, does get updated automatically if you make a change to app config. So the cached version in your functions updated. The idea of using it for affiliate applications and single sign-on is a very different concept in the cloud, and would involve a whole separate talk to talk about how we might handle that.
Yeah. I think that's enough on SSO.
Yep.
Okay, so let's just wrap up then. So one of the things we can say is that that if you're going to rebuild BizTalk apps in Azure Integration Services, you do need to piece together much of the technology yourself, but the toolkit is amazingly rich and broad, and there's an awful lot in there that you can do. And actually, once you're actually using the AIS toolkit, the possibilities that are opened up to you are immense. And also, just going back right to the start, that the reason why this is all a hot topic at the moment is that the BizTalk migrator is probably going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you in terms of build. If you've got a BizTalk app that you wanted to migrate into the cloud, that migration tool is likely to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you and give you a consistent sort of result in AIS. We're not entirely sure exactly when it's going to be released, and we're not entirely sure how rich the features are going to be when it's released. But it's coming soon, so keep an eye on that. So okay, we've got to
Have we got time? We're over time. But
We're over time. So one of the things to say is thanks everyone for watching. We will kind of go through some of the questions now, but what we'll do is all the questions from today and the questions from last time, we'll publish those. And so please keep an eye on messages that come from the Eventbrite, whatever, because we'll send a link out to all the attendees for the master list of Q&A that we're going to start keeping updated.
Yeah.
So let's have a look at some of the questions that come through. So thanks for this one, Peter. Besides the 350 plus connectors and the low code benefit with logic apps, Azure Functions can mostly do what logic apps do. In what cases should we choose logic apps over functions? That's a great question.
It's a very good question. And in fact, what's really interesting is if you were watching the Integrate 2020 conference and Matt Farmer's talk about logic apps running on functions, it's really interesting that he announced that there is a version of logic apps that runs on top of functions, specifically on the durable functions. So you're right. When do you choose one or the other? And the way I describe this to people is usually to say, well, when I start work with an orchestration in BizTalk, I've got a choice of using all the BizTalk actions, the orchestration shapes, or I can just put a single expression shape and call out to a C# class and do it all in C#. Why shouldn't I do the entire thing in C#? It's not quite the same. The thing about it, to me at least, is to do with opaqueness. Yes, you could go and do everything in a function. There's a lot you can do, especially with durable functions and stateless and the like. But you don't get the visibility you get with, say, a logic app where you can look at a flow and see what it's doing. But I think the answer is that you should be using both. You should be using functions and logic apps. Functions, we don't have the connectors, but you could then call out to a function to do the code. I'm a big believer that you always put APIM in front of a function as well. We don't directly call a function necessarily. We hide that object to APIM first. But
we've barely touched on APIM actually.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
The answer, Peter, is it depends. If what you can do can be done in either, you've got to make a choice on how visible you want it to be and where your starting point is. If you're starting from a function, then it might make sense to keep it going in a function. If you're starting in a logic app and you could do it in a logic app, then maybe keep it in the logic app as well. But it's not an easy question to answer. It's not black and white as it might be, say, in BizTalk.
Okay, and another one from Peter, which is another great question, which is what would be the biggest challenges that a company will face if they start migrating BizTalk to AIS? What are the things that will stop a company doing the migration now and make them wait a while, e.g. limitations in AIS? Which, really again, it's a really good question, and we could spend hours on just this one alone.
But I'll tell you, the first thing that puts people off, well, apart from maybe lack of experience in working in logic apps or AIS, is how you cost it. We know that when we buy BizTalk, we're paying for a license fee per machine. We cost it up front. We know how much it's going to cost. With AIS, the first question, almost every client, I think every client I've worked with, says, well, how much is it going to cost me? Here's my budget. What's it going to cost? I'm like, well, I don't know. What are you going to be doing with it? So you have to sit down and work out, well, approximately how many logic apps and functions, what Azure resources will I need? If I'm writing logic apps, how many actions are going to be executed on average? How many executions, how many runs of that logic app going to happen? What types of actions am I running? Am I using enterprise connectors? How many connectors have I got? How many default actions have I got? And from that, you have to then extrapolate forward to work out an average cost. If you're not happy with that, you can move towards an AIS. And AIS, I describe it over here in the UK as the difference between pay as you go and pay monthly. An AIS is pay monthly. You don't pay any more than that monthly amount. You pay as you go. You can pay a little amount or a large amount. But an AIS is very expensive. You need to be doing a lot of work to be using it.
And the thing with an AIS is that an AIS is effectively, they're expensive, but what you're doing is you're reserving a bunch of compute resources, and they are, you're standing up VMs just for you, and that's what you're paying for with an AIS, and that's why it seems expensive compared to everything else, because nothing, all this other stuff we've been talking about with serverless is, is pay as you go, it's pay on demand. If you're not using it, you're not paying for it, and whereas an AIS is, here's a bunch of servers that I'm provisioning that are all dedicated to me, and in every cloud that costs you money.
But you've got to bear in mind too, Andrew, that I mean, it might look expensive per month, but think about what you're paying overall for your BizTalk resources. Your licenses alone, you might be paying 180K, in 180,000 pounds or dollars in BizTalk and SQL Server licenses. Then you've got all your infrastructure. Then you've got the staff looking after that infrastructure. Then you might have some sort of licensing plan for BizTalk, that sort of thing. And
then you've
when
got
you look
all
at that, suddenly,
stuff.
4,000 a month doesn't look too bad,
Yeah. So one of the other things that I mean, just following on with this question, I mean, some of the other challenges, like I say, financial is one of them, because one of the and one of the big breakpoints here is really, it's all about investment cycles. So when you come round to, when you're, let's say you've got, BizTalk 2013 and it's in extended support, and the servers are starting to become unreliable. You've got to invest that 180K or whatever it is in your next implementation. I mean, that's a big driver to sort of say, hey, do you know what? If we went pay as you go, instead of spending all that lump sum straight up front now, and instead we went cloud based, and that's that's kind of a big driver for that. I suppose the question is about challenges though, and I suppose some of the things are. And it's a really difficult question to ask because every case is different. But as a general thing, I think that the more that moving to logic apps over BizTalk is a microcosm of a company's entire cloud strategy. Because there's no point in moving to AIS if you haven't moved anything else into the cloud.
No, if everything's on-prem.
Yeah, but if everything else is on-prem, then why would you? However, as you might replace your packaged software with SaaS systems, you might be and you might be lifting and shifting other stuff into the cloud, or creating new cloud native apps. As more and more things go into the cloud, it becomes that's what the pull is. Whereas it's I don't think there are really many limit. AIS has come on a long way over the last few years, and that I don't really feel there's anything that you can't do in the cloud that you can do now that you can do in BizTalk. No,
there are political challenges though. Almost every company, someone is worried about security, or they're saying that why are we going from on-prem to the cloud? Our data's in the cloud. Do we trust it? And I often have the same conversation every time, which is really so. If you're on-prem, do you really have a server room in your basement somewhere in your building? Most people, they have a data center. They don't think about it, but they've outsourced their server hosting to someone else. Or they have another building, and effectively moving to Azure, you're just using a different data center provider, and at least Microsoft then have put a lot of money into security, for example. In fact, they've got bigger pockets than maybe your local internet service provider who's hosting your data center. So you might find it's actually more secure in that way. But that's a political thing. It's a paradigm shift, getting your head around, because people don't necessarily understand the cloud. They don't know what it means.
It's not a technical issue. It's a exactly. It's a perception. It's a softer skill. It's skills. It's understanding. It's knowledge. That sort of thing.
But the challenges are definitely around skills and knowledge. It's a whole new area, especially for a company that doesn't have Azure. They've got to learn, support, monitoring, cost, development. All that is different. If you had all that, then you begin to see, well, actually, certain things are a lot easier. I can spin up a POC in AIS much quicker than I ever could in BizTalk. But the way you solve the problems can be subtly different as well. It's a difficult question to answer, Peter. Then there are challenges. There's generally answers to most of those challenges, but a lot of the challenges come from the fact that it's different. It's something new, and people often aren't willing to embrace that straight away.
Okay, and just there's kind of a related similar question, which is what happens. This is from Carl. Are currently using BizTalk and not willing to move to public cloud. Aren't they being pushed to explore other options which provide similar benefits, like serverless benefits on private cloud?
That's a really good question. Yeah.
So I mean, again, there's a lot going on in this space, because obviously one of just from one of the things that Microsoft are working on at the moment is to try to make the distinction between cloud and on-prem ever more blurred, so that you haven't got the penalties. So so there isn't as much of a difference. So the things that you can do on cloud are coming on-prem. It's and in particular, there is in general, the world is moving towards containerization in a massive way, and so I think there's a lot of your answers kind of lie in the fact that that's the way the world's moving. The world is moving containerized, and containers can run anywhere. And so if you're really worried about where things are, then your solution will be to run your containers where you're happy with them.
Yeah, and I think it's very clear from the announcements at the conference last month that Microsoft are working on an on-prem solution for Logic Apps. In fact, today you can join the preview program, write your Logic Apps. They run on functions. You can deploy them locally. You can deploy them into a container, and off you go. So I think it will become more blurred over time, Karthik. I think that there will be the option to run Logic Apps, whether they be in containers or whether they be deployed into some sort of function runtime that you're running locally. So you'll have the choice as to whether or not you want to go up to public cloud. If you want it private cloud, you could do an AIS. If you don't mind the cost, you can then connect that up to your network, virtual network, an express route or a VPN or something. So there are still concerns, but I think most of those concerns, personally, I think a lot of those concerns are not necessarily founded in the reality, but are founded in misconceptions on what the cloud actually is. But that's a whole discussion we could go into.
Yeah. So I think we need to wrap up there. We're already kind of way over on time.
Yes.
Just a couple of quick announcements. I mean, firstly, if you actually wanted to get involved in BizTalk migration a bit more, Microsoft is still inviting people to take part in the private preview. So you can contact Valerie Robb at Microsoft. She's the Senior Program Manager for BizTalk, and it's valerie.robb@microsoft.com. And the next webinar is in 2 weeks' time, where we're going to look at part 2 of this, where we're actually going to sort of break this down and sort of have a look in detail at what this stuff looks like when it's in what a BizTalk application. So the things we've been talking about in the technology, we're going to get a bit more hands-on with that and look at what that actually looks like. So that's sort of part 2 of this deep dive. So on that note, I'd just like to thank everyone for taking part. If you want to get in touch, contact me on andrew@345.technology or dan.probert@affinis.com, and there's our LinkedIn addresses. And please check out Azure Integration Group, where we will be feeding you with useful knowledge, information, announcements on this space. So anything, so we're just trying to share as much as we can. That's the place to go if you want to learn more on this subject, and
including answers to questions. So the ones that we
including answers to questions. Yeah, that's an excellent point, Dan. So we'll be putting those on the Azure Integration Group site, and we'll share the link out afterwards for this for the webinar. So thanks a lot for that, and we hope to see you on the next one in a couple of weeks. And thanks for helping out, Dan. That's been a fantastic deep dive onto the technology stuff.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone else. Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye now.